buried in that explosive whistleblower complaint released this morning details that suggest there are more witnesses than we knew to the alarming conduct that's now at the center of impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. The complaint describes a handful of officials who knew about the July 25th phone call between Donald Trump and the president of Ukraine. From the report, quote, based on my understanding, there were approximately a dozen White House officials who listened to the call. In addition to the White House personnel, I was told that a State Department official also listened on the call. The complaint also name checks at least 6 other U.S. officials beyond the president who may have been involved in some of the conduct. Those officials include Rudy Giuliani, aforementioned, Attorney General William Barr, Vice President Mike Pence, as well as 2 U.S. diplomats and a U.S. attorney. Joining our conversation, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. Joyce Vance, I've wanted to talk to you all day long. This whistleblower came out when Claire and I were on live TV. The nation saw the tops of our heads and our eyeglasses as we poured over it. What do you make of all of it, and specifically of this sprawling, what looks like, I hate to use this word because I know it's legally significant, but it sure looks like a conspiracy to me.
I think that word is legally significant, Nicole, and I've been watching you all today. Really happy that I was not on the air with you all when this dropped.
Missed you.
And y'all did a remarkable job, I thought, of getting to the most important points very quickly. And it is, I think, something that we did not expect to learn, how broad the number of people whose conduct will now come into question is. This is folks in government, people in the White House who somebody came up with this notion that the president's conduct was so horrible that they had to conceal it, and that they would do that by abusing the classification system. So there are now a number of questions that have to be addressed. I think it's very likely that the Attorney General needs to recuse, and some of these questions will have to be revisited at DOJ. We learned yesterday that DOJ had decided pretty quickly after receiving this transcript that they wouldn't open a case. Now I think, though, they need to go back and look, because there are people involved beyond the president. They may have to examine conduct by a number of people, and obviously they need to be looking at more crimes in addition to the campaign finance violation, because the heart of a conspiracy is an agreement to do an illegal act. It looks like a number of people here we don't know for certain, but certainly enough to warrant investigation, may have been involved in concealing what they believed was actionable conduct by the president. It could even be obstruction of justice. The facts are very unclear right now, so it's difficult, I think, to make any sort of a final judgment. But there is a lot to look at here, and that's before you even get to Congress's separate responsibility to consider whether this is an abuse of trust that warrants impeachment.
So I asked this question yesterday, and I didn't understand the answer. I'm going to ask it again today, and you know how to explain legal shenanigans for dummies. Let me ask you this. The DNI, acting DNI today, testified under oath that he had transmitted the whistleblower complaint. He had referred it to DOJ for either criminal investigation or a national security investigation. The Inspector General from the intelligence community has a track record of doing exactly that. That was the office, the officials that referred Hillary Clinton's email case to the Department of Justice, where, as we all know, it was investigated and investigated and investigated. Who made the decision at DOJ that, with all this evidence, with Donald Trump saying, with what was in the record, just in the record, that Donald Trump was holding up military aid to Ukraine, with Donald Trump's own notes from the call, the White House version that was released, say, I need a favor from you, though. Need you to investigate Joe Biden and his son. How was that not at least worthy of investigation?
So I'm torn on this one, and I'll tell you why. The reporting that we have is that the career people at DOJ, not political people, made the decision not to open a case. I think it's likely that they would have given it a good look. I'm sort of biased and would tend to trust the career people. But the reporting also says that they only looked at campaign finance violations. And if that reporting is in fact accurate and they didn't look at anything else, then they need to go back and revisit the decision.
But on the campaign finance violation, how is it not a thing of value to get dirt on your opponent?
It looks to me like a classic campaign finance violation, Nicole. I think it's difficult sometimes to second guess people who have more facts than you, but I almost wonder here if maybe they had less facts than we do. Maybe they didn't have all of this, didn't see the significance. And the kicker here is this. The Inspector General for the intelligence community came out of the District of Columbia U.S. Attorney's Office, where he was a leader in that office's public corruption and fraud unit. During the Obama administration, under a Democratic U.S. attorney, he had a record for prosecuting Democrats for public corruption. This is someone who's hard-charging, who's fair. For him to make the decision that this was something that was credible, that needed to be dealt with urgently, and then for DOJ just to say, nothing here to look at, that contradiction is surprising. It raises, I think, a lot of eyebrows. At a bare minimum, career professionals in DOJ need to revisit this issue, and the Attorney General needs to be firmly out of the loop on that.
Well, and the Attorney General, it would seem, compromised by Donald Trump, who said to a foreign leader, hey, let's violate campaign finance laws here in the U.S. together, and you can get in bed with Rudy and Bill to help you. I mean, that is what he said. He said, call Bill Barr and call Rudy. But here's what the Ukrainians heard. I mean, you also, I don't know, if you were to open an investigation, maybe you would hop over to the Ukraine and ask them about this. Multiple U.S. officials told me that the Ukrainian leadership was led to believe that a meeting or phone call between the President, Trump, and President Zelensky would depend on whether Zelensky showed willingness to, quote, play ball on the issues that had been publicly aired by Mr. Lutsenko and Mr. Giuliani.
Yes, I mean, that's a classic way diplomacy works, and Ben would know this better than I, that at a lower level, you're having all of these conversations about, like, Zelensky wants to have a White House visit, and Trump...
Yeah, but usually it's like he wants to go at a state dinner, he wants full, it's like full or partial,
but there's
lunch
always,
or dinner.
Yeah.
It's not like dig up dirt on Biden and you'll get your
No,
billing.
of course. So it's usually incremental things. We need you to show a little more leg on this or that. In this case, it's about basically violating the Constitution and violating law, and then we'll have the conversation with you. I mean, this goes back to something Ben was talking about earlier. I mean, Ukraine it's tragic because it's been a hotbed of corruption since it became free in 1991. I mean, and basically all of the reporting shows that when you have these prosecutors before, the way they operated was, I'm going to prosecute you, but if you give me a bunch of dough, I'm not going to do it. That's how prosecution worked in Ukraine. And again, as Ben knows, we, from the beginning, were over there in Ukraine saying, you've got to end this prosecution, because our goal was Ukraine as a free and democratic country in the heart of Europe. And corruption intercedes, gets in the way of democracy. That's what we wanted to fix. That's why this charge against Biden seems so silly, because Biden was there saying, clean it up or else you're not going to be a democracy.
And what do you make of all of the, what would appear to be accomplices?
Well, what it tells me, Nicole, is that this is actually how business is conducted in this White House. You know, that this didn't seem that unusual, that you could have the vice president and people from the State Department involved in this as well. And there was another very important piece that came out in the reporting. You know, we've talked about how this call was placed into a separate system. Well, the reporting suggests that there are other calls that have been similarly kept from the normal channels of dissemination. Other calls that have been hidden behind this firewall of false classification. So it tells me that the corruption is deeper than even just this one call or even this one episode, and that this is kind of how things operate there. And yeah, as Rick says, normally it would be something like, you know, we would like you to clean up corruption in your country as a part of the moving towards a state visit, not we would like you to engage in corruption as a means of getting this state visit, right? So what I see with all these people involved and the reporting that there are other calls like this, that the corruption in our entire foreign policy, kind of as Claire said earlier, goes beyond just this one episode. And what you see is a president of the United States not acting as the leader of the free world. He's acting like Vladimir Putin. This is how Putin would operate with other countries. This is how Putin would operate within his own system. If you do my bidding or else you will be punished.
And this is how Putin's attorney general would operate. I mean, what do you make of Barr's role?
Well, here's the riddle me this, Batman. Can you imagine what Trump does if Barr recuses himself? I mean,
I'm told he never will. I'm told by a former senior DOJ official he never will.
And maybe Joyce can help us here, but it seems to me that the ethics honchos at DOJ need
Who
to
I'm
be
sure have been sent on sabbatical.
Well, they need to be answering this question with this information now in the public space. And if, in fact, this file goes back over for reconsideration, which it should, and Barr is told by the ethics folks, hey, you can't be on this one. I mean, Trump will lose it because that's his whole thing. He wants a guy there to fix it for him, and he's got his inside guy Barr and his outside guy Rudy. And it's dumb, dumb, dumber, dumb, dumb, dumb. 3.
What could go wrong?
So the Barr has proven himself. He's shown us who he is in the Mueller episode, all of that. But this is not going to get any traction with Republicans, right? So what Democrats want to do to keep this narrowly focused in an impeachment investigation is try to push this national security funny bone among Republicans and these constitutional questions. They have just had money for military installations, some of which have asbestos coming out of the ceiling, unsafe schools. They've been battered by hurricanes. The president promised Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida the money was coming. He has diverted them to a wall in the states of vulnerable Republican senators who are up in cycle next year for election. I mean, there are all of these constitutional separation of powers issues, and those are the ones they are never going to wink an eye at what went on with turning down a criminal investigation into a campaign finance violation. What they're going to be upset about is the many people who put country before party and sounded the alarm with the whistleblower on what they saw going to a separate computer system, and that's why you saw Senator Johnson come out about that. And those are the issues Democrats are going to have to keep the pressure on.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.